Team has gathered and it's time for the Public Square from the American Policy Roundtable. Welcome, everyone. I'm Wayne Shepard here with Dave Zanotti, Melanie, Elsey, Rob Walgate, Jeff Sanders, and Alan C. Duncan with us as well, our producer. And Dave, this is another one of those programs I think people are not going to want to miss.
You know, Wayne, I was reading a couple of articles by the Associated Press, NBC News, and others about what's going on in regards to Title IX funding, federal education dollars, and what's it going to mean in local schools. And the articles are pretty controversial, and they're being talked about everywhere. I got to the end of both articles, and I came back to this basic question. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one that's asking this question, which is, whose idea was it to get the federal government involved in funding schools in the first place?
Okay, there's the question of the day, huh?
There it is. So before we get too deep in that, I think we needed to discuss what is Title IX. And we happen to have, I don't normally introduce the panel members with backgrounds and bios because people that have been listening to this broadcast for years now, we've been on the air a long time, they kind of know. But especially for our new listeners, Melanie Elsey has made a lifetime career of education policy. Now, she's made public policy her career, but with if she was a practicing or practitioner, if she was a surgeon, you would say, what's her specialty?
Yeah, right.
Melanie's specialty is education policy and healthcare policy. She is highly esteemed and respected. I could tell you all kinds of stories. I'm just going to tell you, folks, you're going to know just from hearing, but Melanie knows what she's talking about. So, Melanie, take us back to the basic sort of building blocks. What's Title IX?
Title IX was a portion of a federal law that was established in 1972 that really, for the first time, prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs that were receiving federal funding. That would be K-12, collegiate level, education programs across the country that were recipients of the federal dollars had to conform to a non-discriminatory policy in terms of someone's biological sex originally.
So this is one of the mechanisms by which the federal government is involved in regards to school funding. Now, and the connection. So let's take a look at the headline. The headline on NBC News says this. The date on this was, for people's frame of reference listening going forward over the next years, is April 19th, 2024. Biden's new Title IX rules protect LGBTQ students, but trans sports rule still on hold. The subtext says the new rule makes crystal clear that everyone can access schools that are safe, welcoming, and that respect their rights, Education Secretary Miguel Cardona said. Now, you can't have all that headline unless it's an internet story, obviously. In the old days, you'd have half the paper filled with the headline.
Yeah, my old news writing course, that would have failed me.
You would have been bounced quite quickly, Wayne, if that was the case.
Yeah.
So this is the new era of internet news. So that's a pretty big headline, and that's a pretty big story. We don't want to bury that story. But before we get there, let's just put an interesting anchor in the ground that most people forget. How long has the federal government had an interest in the notion of public education, in general education? This goes the whole way back before Congress was Congress, because the Northwest Ordinance was passed by the Continental Congress. It was passed at the same time that the formation of the Constitutional Convention was building the United States Congress. After the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress still existed, and one of the first provisos that they put together, and then this was all then transferred over into the brand new Congress of the United States, was the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance was a document. It's one of really our core founding documents. We talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Well, the Northwest Ordinance is right in that as well, because it was the Northwest Ordinance that established how America would grow. Even while we're building the country, the Continental Congress is talking about, and then what we're going to do is this. We're going to expand the country. And what would be the criteria by which a territory could be established and then become a state? And what would the priorities be for that to become legitimately viewed as a part of the Union? And education was a pivotal part of that understanding. And what's interesting about it is it wasn't just, we're going to start public schools. Nope, those words don't appear. What is it, Melanie? Religion, morality?
Religion and morality. Article 1 of most state constitutions will include a requirement that the state itself encourage schools, education, because of how important it was to the development of their culture and society. And that was, Dave, that was before the 10th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct.
So the 10th Amendment puts parameters around the federal government in that it cannot establish constitutional principles that aren't enumerated. It can't enforce constitutional principles at the federal level that are not enumerated in the Constitution itself, that whatever is not a part of this document is reserved to the states and then to the people. And education policy falls into that category.
I never understood the emphasis from the Northwest Ordinance regarding education until I read McCullough's book, The Pioneers, Dave, which he brings that out quite clearly.
And that's not to say that schools weren't publicly funded or even started prior to the Northwest Ordinance. Mm-hmm. The first publicly funded school was in 1635.
Wow.
In
Massachusetts?
In Massachusetts, Denholm, Massachusetts. And it was after that, the Massachusetts Act of 1647 established the right of that state colony to require communities to create and maintain elementary schools in all the towns and then secondary levels of education in the larger towns.
Do you know who the first teacher was?
I don't. What's that, Josh?
The pastor of the church was the first schoolmaster. Why? Because he was the best educated.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Most pastors back in those days not only knew English very well, but they also were fluent in Hebrew, Greek, and in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at the words of the Northwest Ordinance. In Article 3, it says, religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged.
And that is the phrasing that you'll find in most state constitutions.
Yes, and that language is there to this day in most states. And so to become a part of the United States, you had to adopt this as a part of your existence. So the concept of that there was a federal, or in essence, a joint agreement among the colonies, now states, and for that even to be a state and then to become a state, you had to have a commitment and an understanding that educating the people that lived in your territory was absolutely essential. And why was it essential? Because religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So, I mean, just you don't have to overstate it. It's there. That's the first place. Now, we do not see any funding structures connected to that, any policy tentacles working their way down. You don't see curriculum standards there. What you see is the fundamental platform, the truth basis upon which we agree that for this country to survive, for good government to exist, we're going to have religion, morality, and knowledge taught in schools. So everybody gets it. It doesn't work if you don't do this. It's sort of like we've got this great idea for a car, but you're going to need 4 wheels. And if you don't have the 4 wheels, you're not going to have a car. So this is kind of the way this was structurally established. So to say that the federal government has never been involved in education, well, that's ridiculous. The theory, the concept, the recognition of the absolute importance of education is critical. The question becomes, when did the money come in? When did the money come in?
Well, Dave, it's interesting because in looking back through some of the notes and the different pieces and parts of history that I've accumulated, I was reminded that the first semblance of a Department of Education. It really wasn't a cabinet level agency. It was in 1867 established, signed into legislation through Andrew Johnson. But that was just an agency that had 4 employees, and they were handling fact-finding duties. So they weren't, mandating anything or
statistics. They were just collecting data.
Basically collecting data.
That's all they were doing.
Correct.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I'm guessing Melanie, you said this is 1867.
Correct.
And this was under the Johnson administration. Of course, Johnson took over the presidency after Lincoln was assassinated. And so we're in the middle of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction has a huge education component associated with it. So I can understand that the administration of Andrew Johnson needed 4 people to keep the statistics to find out if, in fact, education was moving out across the entire country, coming back together again.
Yeah, the United States government had established the Freedmen's Bureau. And so they were trying to educate former slaves throughout the South. So they probably had a hand in that to some degree.
Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until Jimmy Carter's administration that they established the Department of Education as a cabinet-level agency. That was in 1979, right?
Yep,
right.
Yep.
Well, wait a second. Wayne, we got to come back to that.
Yeah, we do.
That's like a cliffhanger.
But don't forget Lyndon Johnson. Not Andrew Johnson, but Lyndon Johnson.
Okay, we will get to that coming up. Get the background here on Title IX, and we're moving ahead on the public square. You stay with us.
Introducing the latest program from the Public Square.
Kids on the Square.
We at Kids on the Square are dedicated to helping teach the next generation through topics like Bible stories, scientific marvels, and American history. We want to equip parents with fun and free educational resources to share the truth with their children. Won't you join us? New episodes are released monthly. You can listen wherever podcasts are available and visit kidsonthesquare.com to find out more. Thank you, and
welcome to Kids on the Square.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
I feel like we need some dramatic music here to introduce our segment, since we left it as a cliffhanger there a few moments ago, talking about Title IX today. Dave, you want to resolve this conflict for us?
Wait, let's repeat that last line. It wasn't until Jimmy Carter that we had a cabinet-level Department of Education in the United States of America. Now, for some of our youngest listeners, Jimmy Carter was a president before you were born. But he was a president that left office in 1980. So we're only talking about, 54 years ago? We've only had a cabinet-level Department of Education in the United States for 54 years. Melanie, why is that significant?
Because a lot has transpired in 54 years. It's interesting that if you go back to the 1867 Department of Education, it was actually 1 year later demoted to what was called the Office of Education because they were concerned it would get too powerful. So here we are in just little over 50 years at having a cabinet-level agency. Think of how much power is wielded now, that it is driving unwanted policies, unlegislated policies, I would even say, down to a local school district from the federal government, which it was never intended to do.
That takes us right to the headline, Wayne. Biden's new Title IX rules protect LGBTQ students, but trans sports rules still on hold. Okay, let's start to break this down because this is a good telling of the news in this article. First off, Title IX is, as Melanie mentioned, a law that was passed by Congress, and that it deals with what at that stage in the game was defined for purposes of federal law as sex. And sex, when Title IX was passed in the 70s, and not just Title IX, but the general understanding in federal law at that time was that when the law said race, creed, sex, color, sex meant gender, and gender meant male and female. That's history. You can't refute that. You can go back and document it a million different ways, but that's the fact. So now let's take a look at what the actual article reads, and giving credit to the Associated Press here. The rights of LGBTQ students will be protected by federal law, and victims of campus sexual assault will gain new safeguards under rules finalized Friday by the Biden administration. The new provisions are a part of a revised Title IX regulation issued by the Education Department, fulfilling a campaign promise pledged by President Joe Biden. He had promised to dismantle rules created by former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who added new protections for students accused of sexual misconduct. Okay, let's back up. The new provisions are part of a revised Title IX regulation. And what these are called is they are called provisions and they are called rules. Now, Melanie, I thought that if there was going to be federal education policy, it would be Congress that would be passing the law. This is not Congress passing a law, right?
No, it isn't. And this is what makes the executive agencies, not just the Department of Education, so dangerous in when they begin to bleed out beyond congressional intent. So Congress in 72 passed a framework with a basic understanding of terminology at that time. And we have seen the vocabulary and the terms morphed into something that they never were originally. I've got a letter that was issued as guidance from the U.S. Department of Education back in 2016, where they have a section called terminology, and they're defining gender identity as it refers to an individual's internal sense of gender. And that gender identity has to become, it's mandated that the department treat the student's gender identity as the student's sex for the purpose of Title IX. So what in 72 was a biological definition, in 2016 morphed into a social cultural definition at the tail end of President Obama's administration.
Now, it's important to know that the law didn't change.
Correct.
What Congress passed, and a title means that Congress has created a portion of the United States Code. And Title IX is a portion of the code created by Congress, not created by the Department of Education, not created, obviously, by the courts, but created by the Congress. But then, and Melanie taught me this many, many years ago, there are laws that Congress creates, and then there are rules that are created by the administrative agencies. And that's called not the U.S. Code, not USC, but that's called the Administrative Code. And those
and
rules,
that same structure exists at every state level as well.
Yes. And so those administrative code rules are not passed by a vote of anybody. Those administrative codes are passed by the agencies. Those are not representative agencies. These are internal agencies. Now, they open themselves up to these public hearing periods where they have these, it's like, okay, we're going to open the phone lines and you can tell us what you think about what we're going to do. There's no essence of, you could have a million people all say, don't do it, and they do it anyhow. They're
That's
under
exactly
no obligation.
Right. It's what's called a public comment period. And so by law, administrative rules have to go through public comment. So what we're seeing now that has been put into the books in 2024, we actually have gone through probably 3 different renditions since 2020. So they released a set of draft rules in 2020. They released a different set of draft rules in 2022. They released a different set of draft rules in 2023. All told, those rules received probably more than 250,000 comments from the public. But to your point, the agency, the Department of Education, doesn't have to change anything based on public. They're not required to adapt the language of the rules to what the public is wanting. They're just required to get their opinion. And okay, we got your opinion. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
So it by and large, it's a ruse. It's just a game.
Exactly.
So here's what we're talking about. Now let's break this down. The federal government is telling local school systems, this is how reality will work in the way you will conduct yourselves as public schools in regards to the entire LGBTQ question. Whatever the question might be, whether it's pronouns or bathrooms or sports, whatever it is, the federal government is saying, you will do this as we dictate, not by an act of Congress, but by a decision of administrative agencies acting directly at the command of the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. So the President and his team tell the Department of Education, this is what reality is going to be. The Department of Education creates the administrative code. The administrative code goes out for the show trial of the show hearings of public comment. But in essence, it's what the administration wants. And what this particular administration wants is to be able to tell everyone exactly what the rules are going to be on the LGBTQ question. So you say, well, wait a minute. They don't have congressional authority. They don't. What are they doing here? What's the string? Where's the accountability? It's simple. If you don't do what the Department of Education says, they pull your federal funding. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about kindergarten or college. If you take a dime from the federal government, they will tell you how you will handle everything they tell you to do in regards to the LGBTQ question, agenda, issue, put anything you want next to that. It's now being completely dictated by the Department of Education. Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong. Am I missing something?
No, you're right on point. They have the U.S. Department of Education has produced a fact sheet. One statement that is made in this fact sheet that to me is so out of bounds. The final regulations, this is a quote, the final regulations also reaffirm the department's core commitment to fundamental fairness for all parties. Unquote. Let that sink in.
All parties.
All parties.
Say that again?
Quote, the final regulations also reaffirm the department's core commitment to fundamental fairness for all parties. End quote. That's an egregious statement when you are having women being taken back in time to where they are actually receiving discrimination based on the participation of biological males in the sport programs. There's no fundamental fairness there. It can't even be construed to that. But their definition of fundamental and fairness is obviously way different than the average American.
How about fairness for the parents who don't want this?
Right.
The parents who say, I don't want these men and boys in the same locker room as my daughters. I want to protect my daughters. Where's the fairness to the father and the mother there?
Right.
I don't see it.
So there are so many questions, Wayne, we've got to get into. Now we're going to draw out specifically what this sort of mushy okay, they're getting regulations and now they're coming down to the schools. What do the regulations mean? We've already started, but we've got to go farther in explaining how this will change everything and who will have a voice, if anyone will have a voice, to disagree.
Yeah. You may already know that you want to share this program with someone else, perhaps someone who's involved in education especially. If you do, just use our website, thepublicsquare.com, to share the link for this program, or use the smartphone app and let them know about the app, and they can listen there as well. The Public Square app is available free in your respective app store. More coming up on the Public Square. So we're talking about Title IX today and how it has morphed into a bunch of rules and regulations not made by Congress. Just a little note to the conversation team here. And by the way, the team is Dave Zanotti, Melanie, Elsey, Rob Walgate, Jeff Sanders, and Elsey Duncan. Just a note to you guys that any Christian college, private university, any private university that takes federally backed student loans students who have those student loans, they are subject to Title IX as well, which brings federal regulation onto their campus.
Any connection that can be made between a federal dollar and a school enables the Department of Education to take control over how whatever rules are published under Title IX are administered on that property.
And for that reason, there are some private colleges, some private post-secondary institutions that will not take the Pell Grants and other federal funding streams because they do not want those restrictions.
But that used to be considered as a way of protection. But the reality now is that if Title IX is declared, the administrative code laws are there, and they're based on discrimination, it is no immunity from being sued for not participating in doing it that way. In other words, this goes back to, let me explain that. There's been some other changes that have happened in America. It's not just all the Department of Education. We've been talking on this broadcast for years now, going the whole way back to the Supreme Court decision of Lawrence v. Texas, in which Justice Kennedy at that time started what we call the Kennedy Doctrine, in which he decided that he would create a new form of personhood in the dictates of the Supreme Court, and that personhood would be based upon sexual practice or preference. In other words, whatever a person chose to identify as and participate in their sexuality was a platform for creating the right to personhood. And that personhood then had to be protected and could not be discriminated upon. Well, that opinion of Justice Kennedy, which just began as words in a document, became a doctrine of the court. And that doctrine, going through continuing practices and continuing suits and continuing contests, ending all the way with Obergefell and the legalization of same-sex marriage, and in essence, the federalization of that entire question, now has a platform basis in the purposes of law, and it is now being seized upon by federal agencies and by the lower courts. So there's been a subtle change when no one was looking. Congress didn't take a vote and redefine the concept of personhood. The court did. And then everything began to follow in that methodology. So this is an agenda-driven reality that's outside the boundaries of constitutional process and is being fluffed over constantly by big words coming at us from the bureaucracy and reinforced by media people who are writing, who don't have the foggiest idea what they're talking about, the media. They're just repeating the narrative. So everybody thinks this is reality. And gosh, it's probably in the Constitution. No, it's not in the Constitution, to be sure. Not at all. But it's a game. It's a takeover. What it is it's a coup against the concept of parental care, custodial care, and the rights of local communities to govern their own schools. Now you say, well, how did they get such a big hammer? Well, they got such a big hammer based upon the funding. Now, we'll come back to that in just a second.
That's what's interesting to me is to think about you have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. telling school districts in Idaho what they're going to do, in Iowa what they're going to do, in Los Angeles what they're going to do. The decisions being made up on top of the hill, acting like they know what's best for every single community. And when they tie it to the funding, then in essence, they call it federal funding, but where does federal funding come from? It's coming from those people in those local communities to begin with. So the only reason it's federal is because they made you ship it to Washington, D.C. to start.
That's exactly right. And, some people have chastised us, and I think correctly, for calling it federal funding, because that's the common nomenclature. But reality, it's your tax dollars being used against you. And they're sent to Washington, D.C., and everybody takes their take on the way up and on the way down, and then they give it back to you with the conditions that we now have. So what does this mean? Under Title IX, what we are going to be living with is the Department of Education dictating the question as to how students, kindergarten through whatever, in any institution that takes a dime of money connected to the federal budget, that will basically state that the rules of gender as defined by the Department of Education, and at this stage in the game, that definition is 100% in line with the LGBTQ agenda, that's how they're defining it, is what's going to happen in your school. whether you're talking about bathroom access, whether you're talking about pronouns, whether you're talking about curriculum, whatever it is you're talking about will be dictated to you by the federal government or else. That's what's happening. That's what these headlines mean. Melanie, am I overstating the case in any way?
No, actually, I think you're understating the case, because and as an example, a couple of years ago, there were probably more than 20 states attorneys general that challenged a different set of application of the Title IX into the food nutrition programs. So, they're saying that, if an entity receives federal dollars in terms of child nutrition programs, it's not just something that bleeds into sports. It's every aspect. So this is a multi-tentacled beast that it's only going to be resolved as these different cases and complaints trickle up to the Supreme Court.
Well, and thinking about just this top-down model, it to me, it seems like that's such a disrespect for the individual schools, these local communities. One of the articles that we had said that these regulations, quote, wrestle with this, finding that harassing a student, including acts of verbal, nonverbal, or physical aggression, intimidation, or hostility based on the student's nonconformity with stereotypical notions of masculinity and femininity. What school does allow bullying for any reason? Is there a school that allows physical aggression for any reason? Like, you don't have to tell a school to not allow that.
Why do you need the federal government? Well, after this is all said and done, why do you even need a local school board anymore? I mean, they're all just puppets now, right?
That's a good point, Jeff. But to Alan's point, bullying and harassment, in the traditional sense, we have it. When you say bullying, a picture pops into our head of someone being hurt or accosted or physical harm. Their definition of bullying and sexual harassment is using the wrong pronouns.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So that kind of gives their game away a little bit, because to my point, there aren't schools that are allowing physical aggression.
Right.
And if they were, they should stop. But I don't think you need the federal government to tell you not to allow kids to beat each other for any reason.
Well, in most states, it's a violation of a specific state law to do so.
There you go. That's probably a better way to say it. I'm not saying that there aren't any schools struggling with violent behavior amongst their students, but there are laws in place that prohibit assault.
We can take a look at some of the cases, Lawrence v. Texas, Masterpiece Cake Shop, and how many were setups, right? How many were strategically played? So how many Title IX cases are we going to see where they send someone in to set a teacher up that they know may not agree or may not be willing to do it, or just inadvertently doesn't comply because maybe they will only use the student's name and not use those pronouns? So I just think it's just catastrophe waiting to happen.
So let's go back to the premise here. The premise isn't that that as a nation, as a country, we should not care about education. We've cared about education from the beginning. That's the whole point of the Northwest Ordinance. But what's unique about the Northwest Ordinance is it did not create a Department of Education. When the Continental Congress passed it and the United States Congress then adopted it, it did not become the platform to create a Department of Education at the cabinet level, which didn't even begin to have an inkling until after the Civil War and didn't even happen until Jimmy Carter. Something has dramatically gone wrong. We got to talk more about it.
All right, and we will come back to this point in a moment on the Public Square. Thanks for your support. We're here because you want us to be here. We are listener supported, so thanks for that help. And if you'd like to learn more, go to thepublicsquare.com.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
Let's continue the conversation on the public square, talking about Title IX and some administrative code now that really has us deeply troubled. Dave Zanotti?
Yeah, we're looking at the process and how did we get here? There's a sense of false moral authority that if you question these things, if you challenge these things and all, that somehow you're going up against the government, you're going up against history, you're going up against the courts, you're going up against the cause of justice and the purposes of law. It's exactly the opposite is true. When you go back and look at the core history of the Northwest Ordinance and the actions of the American Congress in regards to education, this has been a field that has been dominated by states and local governments. If you study the history of education. Now, just for a second, let's talk about the funding, because this is important. To this very day, where everybody thinks that the federal government controls everything, and the federal law controls everything in regards to schools. Schools can only do what the federal government says they can do, and the states are just the secretaries. They just apply the rules that come down from where? From Congress? No, from the Department of Education. Oh, where's that come from? From the administration. What? But we have been browbeaten into this Politburo style methodology. It is not a part of our history. It's not a part of our Constitution. It's not even a part of our laws. It's something that's been created by administrative agency and now masquerades as law, and everyone is afraid to challenge it.
To that point, is there any evidence that anyone in Congress has this on their radar, this administrative code matter?
Ding,
stuff?
ding, ding. There's the $64,000 question asked by Wayne Shepherd. Where in the world is Congress? Why isn't Congress up in arms and saying you cannot do this with the tax dollars that are being sent here that Congress alone has the right to appropriate? You are so far out of your lane that here's a great idea. We're just going to rescind your existence. So when politicians over the years have called for the abolition of the Department of Education, and everyone's gone, into a pearl-clutching madness, thinking that, oh my goodness gracious, what are we going to do without the Department of Education? We lived without the Department of Education until Jimmy Carter. And you tell me it's gotten better since that time? That's absurd. So, and this is like, I know people's minds are going, that the springs are, boing, boing, boing. What? We have been so propagandized into believing this. But what about the money? The money, they're going to take our money. Okay. We learned this. Melanie, we've been at this education thing for a while. And Wayne, I got to tell you, we've been in some state battles, real battles in the real process, sitting before committees, sitting before governing bodies, sitting in courtrooms, peeling off endless reams of paper back in the day when you actually had to burst the pages from the computer papers, looking at state funding of education, how complicated these formulas are. And every state, they're complicated. There's no state that's got it simplified. And so we know where the money goes. We have a pretty good understanding of how this works. And one of the things that popped up very quickly is we were looking for the line on the federal money. Well, you get through the state money, the local money, the county money, the community money, and then you look at the federal money, and it's like 7%. Wait a second. You're telling me that in this state, on average, the school district gets 7% of their total funding from the federal government? Yeah. Now, it's grown over the years. It's somewhere between 7 and 13%, depending on the state. But the maximum number we can find right now is that federal money coming into schools, this would include money that was, in essence, titled to the schools by Congress, appropriated by Congress, or grants that were made, including federal lunch money, at maximum is 13%. So how does the federal government get total dictatorial control when they're only carrying 13% of the freight? How does that happen?
When you think of the concept of carrot and stick, the Department of Education operates off of carrot primarily. If you want the money, you'll conform to the parameters around that money, per se. So you have monies that come in for what's called disadvantaged pupil impact aid. You've got vocational dollars. You've got, which would be the Carl B. Perkins dollars. You've got special ed monies. You have all these different, lunch monies, as you have said. So those largely go to states as a block, and then states redistribute to the local education agencies. There are some federal dollars that will go straight to a local agency through grant programmings, but it's completely the model of issuing grants. So states can walk away from the dollars. I mean, if they were to pony up that 7 to 13% out of their state budget, they wouldn't need the feds. They wouldn't need the federal resources per se. It's easier said than done because you've got a lot of politicking that goes back and forth in the state budget processes. But if you think about the chunk of dollars that states already spend through their state resources on education, you would think that they could figure out a way to not be under the carrot program offered by the federal government.
So let's once again try to restate and redefine reality here. So we're talking about state dollars. So the state, each state has obviously got a separate printing press and a separate wealth basis, and the state goes ahead and creates this bunch of money, and then they give it to the people in need at the schools, and so it's state money. Absurd, right? Not even qualified as Hansel and Gretel land. What we're talking about here is a situation where the state legislatures and the state administrative bodies are taking our money. Same people, okay? It's the same people that send the money to Washington that send the money to the state capitol. So they're taking our dollars and then they're redistributing them according to the genius of the state legislature as to how those funds ought to go. All right, so what if someone were to stand up in the state legislature and say, I got a great idea. Instead of passing more bathroom bills, let's just pass a law that says we don't take any more money from the Department of Education and the federal government in regards to the funding of schools in state X. We got this. Thank you very much. We'll take care of our own children. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering out loud if DeSantis down in Florida is thinking that he's vowed to fight this. Does he want to take it to the Supreme Court, or does he just want to propose something to the legislature and say, just cut him out?
That's a great point, Jeff, because there's actually 4 states right now.
Oh, really?
That are publicly stating that they will be ignoring these new Title IX regulations. And the 4 states are Florida, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. So that's going to create a pathway, I think, to the Supreme Court.
But why? And that's fine. I mean, that's one strategy. Why would we even need the Supreme Court to do what we can do ourselves?
Right on.
Like note to self, it's our money in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just not send it to them. Let's make it that simple. We're not sending you any more money for this. And we're not taking any money back from you. We're just not going to participate any longer. Now, this is different than an individual coming up with a personal tax protest. I'm not suggesting that under any circumstances. That's another question. That's not the right process to get the solution, in our opinion. In fact, please don't do that. Okay, just don't. We've seen many people try that. You're not going to take on the behemoth by yourself. It's not wise. Because someone's going to write in and say, well, wait a minute, the scripture says pay taxes where taxes are due. We agree completely. And in this country, we get to decide where the taxes are due. And right now what we're doing is really stupid. Okay? And so why don't we simply rise up in the state legislatures and say, we are not going to participate with any more federal money. We're not taking it. It doesn't cross the border here to get to our school systems, and therefore we're free from Title IX.
Let's take our final break. There is a segment coming up on most of these stations. A few you have to leave us at this time. And of course, as always, the rest of the conversation about Title IX can be heard online at thepublicsquare.com and with that smartphone app. I promise we'll be back on most of these stations. Stay with us.
We will be right back for more on The Public Square.
Topic today is Title IX and all that it's become through administrative code. Not law, but administrative code. And that includes some recent developments that have us looking at this topic today, Dave.
Well, we're definitely taking control. The federal government is definitely taking control over parents. That's a really bad idea. And this is going to create nothing but heartbreak and problems and trouble. So before the trouble gets any more, and I do want to go back to the NBC News article, which made it very specific that this action being done by the Department of Education was in response to a direct campaign promise by Joe Biden. Okay, now I didn't say that. NBC News said it, and the administration didn't refute it. It's a situation that's plain and clear. We're playing politics with people's children. Now, that's a really bad idea because from the beginning, we've had a position here, and I think it's worthwhile to share this and to talk about this. The LGBTQ issues that are in question are not new. Study France before the French Revolution. Study ancient Greece and ancient Rome. These issues are not new in the human experience. So this isn't a new thing. What is a new thing in America is for the federal government to take custodial authority over children as it relates to these kinds of agenda items. And that's exactly what the government's doing. They are cutting out parents, cutting out states, cutting out local school systems, local school districts, local building principals, local teachers, and saying, you'll do what we say or else. Now, this is nuts because now they're messing with the kids. And we have said from the beginning, what adults choose to do in regards to their own personal sexuality is nobody's business but their own and their maker, provided they're not breaking the laws against minors or against consent. We are not here saying that there should be sexual police involved in every neighborhood. Don't try to brand this conversation as the government wants to be in your bedroom. No, it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. But what this conversation does say is if grown-ups want to have those kind of conversations in the light of day, in a courtroom and in state lawmakers, in legislatures and the Congress, that's fine. Leave the kids out of it. Leave minor children alone on these subjects. Let custodial care remain with parents and let local school districts work with parents for the good of their children.
So many people talk about original intent. What was the original intent? Go back to 1972. If you would have gotten the DeLorean in 1972 and went to 2024 and said, hey, the rules are going to be tweaked a bit. And the reason they're going to be tweaked is because I know this is being done to protect women, but there's going to be a new definition of what a woman is in 2024. So this is how it's going to look. And people in 1972 would have said, what?
Rob, you couldn't be more. If you just go back to what Scalia was writing from Lawrence v. Texas forward in the early 2000s, he predicted all of the unfolding of this. And people didn't listen to him then.
Well, and I always say, I go back to when we did those shows with Lawrence v. Texas, that was right around the time I was starting to work at Roundtable. And some of the things that I would hear on radio or that we would have discussions about, Dave, and I've said this multiple times, you made some points. I'm like, wow, he's extending that bridge. That bridge is going a little bit. You didn't take the bridge near far enough. I mean, the things that we were talking about, like we're way beyond the expectations of what we thought would happen. We've hit at an accelerated rate, and it's hard for any of us to believe.
And Dave, I think we also need to look at what was the original intent of what the Department of Education would not be back in 1979 when it was established. Can I read you I think it's all one sentence.
No, you don't even have to ask that question. You can read us anything you want.
So in creating the Department of Education, Congress specified the following, quote, no provision of a program administered by a secretary or by any other officer of the department shall be construed to authorize the secretary or any such officer to exercise any direction, supervision, control over curriculum, program of instruction, administration, personnel of any educational institution, school or school system, skip a few words, or over the selection or content of library resources, textbooks, or other instructional materials by any educational institution or school system.
That's incredible.
So they can't establish schools. They can't develop curricula. They can't set requirements for enrollment and graduation. They can't determine state education standards. They can't develop testing or measure whether states are meeting their education standards. Those are all fundamental prongs to what operates schools. So if the feds aren't allowed to do all of that, what they've done is they've tinkered on the edges to get people to come into their circle to do what they want when they can't force you to do it yourself.
So the answer to this is bottom up. Local school districts have the ability to tell the federal government to go pound salt.
Right.
Thank you. We'll do it without the lunch money. We can feed our own kids. We'll do it our way. Thank you. They're not your children. Thank you very much. The state can do the same thing. Counties can do the same thing. Private educational institutions can do the same thing. Now, it takes courage, it takes commitment, but what are we talking about? Maximum 13. Are we talking about sacrificing children on this altar of the LGBTQ agenda for 13% of the money? Is that what our kids are worth to us now? Is that how foolish we think in this country? And look, I don't care whether you agree with the agenda or not. Leave the kids out of it. And so why are we not electing state lawmakers that will take a stand on this? Do they even know what the Northwest Ordinance is? Wouldn't that be a good place to start? Someone says, yeah, I'm running for state rep. You say, great. Talk to me about the Northwest Ordinance. What's it mean? Why was it there? How does it apply today?
How about if we elect people to school boards? Because I was at a meeting back in the fall where people who were running for school boards said, come and meet us and ask us questions. Place was packed with 100 people. It's just a little local school board down the street from where I live. People wanted to know, what are you going to do about boys who think they're girls and want to be in the locker room? I wasn't the only one asking that. There were a whole bunch of other people asking the exact same question. One candidate after another said, we will not allow that. We will not allow that. We will not allow that. Now, however, do we have people on the school board who have the guts to say that the U.S. Department of Education can go pound sand, and if they want to come after us and sue us, which they probably would, we'll stand against it?
So this is where we get to, what price do we place upon the ability of parents to raise their children according to the dictates of their conscience? Where are we on these questions? And because here's where it goes. This is just the beginning. If these rules are established and these practices are established and people protest, and this is all predicated upon discrimination. Now, Rob, watch how this bridge goes right now. How long will it be before when someone even opens their mouth to protest, they're jailed? Because they're participating in discriminatory behavior.
I think that's going to happen when a teacher goes to a school board meeting or when a teacher talks to a superintendent and attempts to have dialogue. I think that picture is going to be painted.
How long will it be before teachers have to literally get out of the field of education altogether because they have moral beliefs and principles and ethics, and they don't see this eye to eye with the LGBTQ agenda, and they are at risk of being fired, even jailed, bankrupted, because they are being branded as participating in discriminatory behavior? How long will these precedents be before the courts take over?
It'll be labeled as hate speech, won't it?
Yeah. Well, then that takes us to the place where how long will it be before someone preaching what the Bible teaches in a community will also be dragged away?
And we've already seen that in Canada to the north of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dave, you mentioned state legislators a little bit ago. There are more than 20 states that have pushed back with statutes on this. Idaho was the first state to prevent trans sports infractions in 2020, and that list has grown over time.
Bottom line, Wayne, it's all the money we're sending anyhow. Maybe the people who send the money should have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
We got to stop there. What a great conversation today. Thank you, team, and thank you for listening to The Public Square online, thepublicsquare.com.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.